By the scorching summer of 1918, the British Army had transformed into an indomitable force, forged in the crucible of 4 years of relentless, brutal warfare. Hard-won lessons reshaped their strategies, seamlessly blending the devastating power of infantry, artillery, tanks, and nascent air power into a unified, lethal punch. This evolution was dramatically showcased on July 4th, with the triumphant capture of Hamel, where Lieutenant General Monash's brilliant planning laid the foundational template. His pioneering tactics ignited the monumental Battle of Amiens on August 8th, marking the dawn of the 100 Days Offensive, the relentless push that would ultimately decide the fate of the Western Front. The Australians, now operating as a formidable, fully fledged corps, were poised to deliver yet another astonishing contribution to the Allied cause. Between August 31st and September 4th, 1918, their efforts would culminate in the audacious seizure of the critical stronghold of Mont Saint-Quentin. As 1918 dawned, what had once been a modest British expeditionary force of 6 divisions had swollen into an entirely different leviathan, a global army numbering millions. Among these vast ranks, etched into history by years of fierce fighting and a legendary battlefield reputation, stood the men of the Australian Imperial Force. Yet, by that pivotal summer of 1918, these remarkable Aussies teetered on the brink of exhaustion. The reason? Back home, 2 referendums aimed at introducing conscription had met with electoral defeat, leaving the ANZV contingent solely reliant on a dwindling pool of volunteers. Despite their profound wariness, these frontline diggers remained among the elite Allied forces on the Western Front, a truth they would spectacularly reaffirm in the impending battle. Across the lines, the German army too was utterly spent, ravaged by the colossal attrition battles of 1916 and 1917 at Verdun, the Somme and Third Ypres. Their precious manpower reserves were critically depleted. Their battlefield doctrine had adapted, now favoring a defense-in-depth strategy, sparsely manned front lines ceded to deeply fortified rear positions, bristling with vast troop numbers and dedicated counter-attack formations. Domestically, Germany faced a dire crisis. The relentless British naval blockade was strangling the population, leading to severe food shortages for both civilians and soldiers alike. Germany, quite simply, was starving. While the war was arguably unwinnable for the Central Powers by mid-1918, the brutal conflict was far from over. Many more agonizing months of combat loomed. To grasp this precarious situation fully, we must rewind briefly to late 1917. That year, 1917, had witnessed 2 seismic shifts. First, in April, the United States had thrown its immense weight behind the Western Allies, and by 1918, American doughboys poured onto the Western Front in ever-increasing numbers, robust, well-equipped, and crucially, fiercely motivated. Their arrival promised to significantly alleviate the crushing burden on the war-weary French and British. However, just prior to this, in late 1917, Russia's Bolshevik Revolution led to the Soviet government's withdrawal from the war. This created a brief, dangerous window in early 1918, where Germany enjoyed a critical manpower advantage, freed from their Eastern Front obligations. Seizing this fleeting chance, the Germans pivoted west, unleashing their formidable might against the French and British, hoping to crush them decisively before overwhelming American numbers could arrive. This devastating series of assaults, launched on March 21, 1918, and known as the Spring Offensive, hurled the British Fifth Army reeling back across the Somme battlefields, threatening to shatter the Allied line entirely. While subsequent German thrusts in April, May, and June were ultimately repelled, with Australian forces notably halting them outside Villers, Breton-X. This marked the absolute high watermark for the German army in the First World War. Critically weakened and bleeding nearly 1 million casualties, the tide irrevocably turned. Momentum swung to the Allies. On August 8, outside Amiens, the big push commenced, tearing through German defenses with the groundbreaking, large-scale combined arms tactics first perfected by Australian troops at Hamel. Within days, German forces were in desperate retreat, clinging to every vital scrap of territory to impede the relentless Allied advance. Every strategic vantage point now assumed immense importance, and the battles for these commanding landscape features were invariably ferocious and immensely costly. Dominating that crucial list of strategic ground was a formidable hilltop, gazing down upon the river and expansive valleys below. Mont Saint-Quentin. Inevitably, as the fighting intensified, the seasoned, battle-hardened Australians were once again summoned to the fore. For the upcoming Allied offensive that summer, Sir John Monash's Australian Corps held its position in the Somme sector, integrated into the British Fourth Army. Its impressive structure comprised the 1st Australian Division, led by Major General Sir Howard Walker, the 2nd Division, under Major General Sir Charles Rosenthal, the 3rd Division, commanded by Major General Jean-John Gellibrand, the 4th Division, directed by Major General Ewan Sinclair Maclagan, and the 5th Division, guided by Major General Joseph Talbot Hobbs. Let us briefly clarify some essential military terms prevalent during the Great War, understanding their exact meaning and hierarchical connection within the era's armed forces. The fundamental building block was the section, typically 12 men strong, commanded by a corporal. 4 sections coalesced into a platoon, roughly 50 men, led by a lieutenant or second lieutenant, aided by a sergeant. 4 platoons constituted a company, officially 227 personnel, often under a major or captain. These 4 companies, augmented by a machine gun section, battalion headquarters, and various specialists, formed a battalion, commanded by a lieutenant colonel, theoretically numbering about 30 officers and 1,000 men. Throughout much of the war, 4 battalions typically comprised a brigade, commanded as expected by a brigadier general, totaling around 4,000 men with attached units. Finally, 3 brigades usually formed a division, overseen by a major general. This formidable unit encompassed 12 infantry battalions, 3 field artillery brigades, 2 engineer field companies, a signal company, a divisional ammunition column, 3 field ambulances, and numerous other specialist detachments, an impressive complement of some 16,000 to 18,000 soldiers. Already worn by intense involvement in the post-Amiens advance, a campaign where all 5 Australian divisions had for the first time fought in unison. The Aussies were undeniably exhausted when, on August 23, they initiated yet another push. This fresh advance targeted the significant town of Pa Run and the winding banks of the Somme River. Monash, skillfully rotating his wary units through the vanguard, propelled his men forward over 5 days, systematically rooting out stubborn enemy strongholds. By August 28, the Australians stood arrayed along the Somme, confronted by a series of formidable obstacles. The initial challenge was the river itself, a formidable barrier several hundred meters wide. The retreating Germans had systematically demolished most key bridges spanning it in this sector, as well as those over the adjacent Somme Canal. Furthermore, the land flanking both sides of the river stretched for hundreds of meters in incredibly marshy terrain, rendering infantry movement nearly impossible. Beyond this quagmire, the Germans, having hastily consolidated, had retreated into an intricate network of pre-existing trench systems from earlier in the war, ready for robust defense. Finally, to the north of the Australian advance lay Mont Saint-Quentin. While not an imposing peak, barely exceeding 100 meters in elevation, its position was strategically flawless for defenders, offering commanding, unobstructed views over the river and Pa Run to its south. Possession of this mont meant control of all the ground below. Crucially for the Australians, capturing the mont would also deny the enemy any chance to dig in further east, implying that its fall would force the Germans into a protracted retreat until they could reach the formidable, once impenetrable Hindenburg Line. To truly appreciate its significance, let's examine it more closely. A modern perspective clarifies its strategic value, though in 1918, the landscape was dramatically different. The prominent woodland that now crowns the hilltop was then far smaller, and years of relentless shelling had reduced it to mere scattered remnants around a largely destroyed cluster of houses just below the crest. Encircling the mont in every direction was an extensive, albeit somewhat aged, network of trenches, having changed hands between German and French forces numerous times. Further safeguarding the area were ubiquitous belts of barbed wire, expertly concealing dug-in machine guns with unimpeded fields of fire stretching for hundreds of meters. Other crucial landmarks for the impending battle included the village cemetery, and beyond it, a distinctive area known as the crater. On the western slopes and within the village itself, numerous walled enclosures offered additional defensive strongpoints. To the southeast, a sugar factory, now largely subsumed by Iran's modern expansion, presented another potential obstacle. In essence, this was an exceptionally challenging objective to seize. What, then, was the audacious plan? Monash had chosen the highly esteemed 2nd Australian Division to spearhead the main assault, crossing the Somme and storming Mont Saint-Quentin at 5:00 a.m. on August 30th. His preliminary objective was to secure a river crossing at Echel. Simultaneously to their south, elements of the Australian 5th Division would either attempt their own crossing, or at minimum, create a vital diversion for the German defenders. Once the crossing was established, the 5th Brigade of the 2nd Division would surge directly up the slopes of Mont Saint-Quentin, seizing its crest, and thereby compelling the Germans in Iran to retreat. When Monash presented his bold strategy to Army Commander Henry Rawlinson on August 29th, he was met with a blunt reply: "So, you think you're going to take Mont Saint-Quentin with 3 battalions? What presumption! However, I don't think I ought to stop you. So, go ahead and try, and I wish you luck." Rawlinson's skepticism, it must be said, was entirely justified. The 5th Brigade was not only facing an uphill charge against a German stronghold bristling with dozens of machine guns, but it was also severely under strength, fielding perhaps only first 200 infantry compared to its theoretical force all Ozard. Compounding this challenge, the Aussies would confront soldiers from 3 German divisions, including the formidable elite 2nd Prussian Guards. Thus, at 4:30 p.m. on August 30th, the 5th Brigade, composed of the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th Battalions, began its approach to the Somme. Immediately, complications arose. Though the bridge over the Echel River remained intact, the causeway beyond was under intense enemy fire, rendering it impassable. A similar predicament arose to the north at Omicourt, where the bridge was severely damaged and under perpetual enemy fusillade. With no viable direct route, the 5th Brigade was compelled to undertake a slow, grueling detour westward to Fuel Res. There, they finally crossed the Somme and advanced along its northern bank, hours behind schedule. Weaving through the lines of the 3rd Australian Division, already holding that sector, they eventually established positions here, on the evening of August 30th. With darkness fallen and the men utterly spent, the attack was, predictably, postponed until the next morning. Let us now consider the formidable challenges they would encounter advancing from this altered direction. In total, 3 battalions were slated to spearhead the offensive, commencing with the crossing of this substantial ditch, today known as the Canal du Nord, but in 1918 merely incomplete and, fortunately, dry canal workings. Once across, the 400 men of the 19th Battalion, who had painstakingly managed to cross the Somme at Omicourt during the night, would advance to the right, closest to the river. Their mission: to seize and secure Agram and Gallipoli Alley trenches, thereby safeguarding the right flank. In the center, the 17th Battalion would undertake the primary advance, scaling a gentle rise to capture Brassard Redoubt, then pressing onward through Godel and Save trenches, before finally pushing through Elsa Trench to seize the village, the infamous crater, and the woodland crowning the summit. On the left flank, the 20th Battalion would forge ahead through Oda Trench and Monash Valley to this road, simultaneously taking Fuel-Accord on their left and the sunken road on Mont Saint-Quentin's lower slopes to their right. Held in support of these 3 leading battalions, poised to reinforce where the need was greatest, stood the ready men of the 18th Battalion. At precisely 5:00 a.m. on Saturday, August 31st, the Australian troops of the 5th Brigade launched their advance, shielded by a thunderous artillery barrage. The crucial element of initial surprise proved decisive. Despite their numerical inferiority and the daunting uphill assault, the 17th Battalion stormed Brassard Redoubt, their battle cries echoing as they charged. In minutes, the redoubt fell, its stunned German defenders seen scattering eastward in disarray. To their left, the 20th Battalion also carved out significant gains, charging with bayonets fixed, systematically bombing the enemy out of Godel and Oda trenches, and clearing Monash Valley before pushing towards the embanked sunken road northwest of the village. The Germans were utterly bewildered by the unprecedented direction, lightning speed, and raw ferocity of the assault. Within minutes, streams of prisoners poured back through the Australian lines, while the attacking diggers pressed on relentlessly, maximizing their crucial element of surprise. By 7:00 a.m., the 17th Battalion, in the heart of the advance, had not only reached but firmly occupied the village of Mont Saint-Quentin and the shattered remnants of the woodland crowning the summit. With over 700 prisoners secured, it was unequivocally clear they had achieved a remarkable victory against a numerically superior foe. Back at British headquarters, Rawlinson was reportedly dumbfounded by the news of Mont Saint-Quentin's capture, a feat that decisively shifted Field Marshal Haig's strategic focus from unlocking the Somme region via Bapaume directly to this pivotal Mont. However, what they remained unaware of was the precise number and harrowing condition of the troops on the ground, and their desperate struggle to establish a cohesive, defensible line. Given their drastically depleted numbers, and the punishing toll of days spent marching and fighting, the Australian positions were perilously tenuous. Knowing the Germans would fiercely resist losing such a vital stronghold, it was merely a matter of time before the inevitable counterattack struck. Australian official historian Charles Bean vividly chronicled this precarious hold day. The Australians, who had expected heavy fighting, hurried with minds now carefree, half running, trying to catch the enemy and taking occasional shots. As each new group of Germans broke from the trenches, the Lewis gunners would throw themselves down for a minute to fire. Those in high command would have been even more astounded had they known the true extent of the Australian force that had seized the hill. A mere 8 profoundly exhausted companies, comprising some 550 riflemen, a handful of machine gunners, and 4 companies of 22 men in close support. Considering such a diminutive force, the situation atop the Mont was, in reality, exceedingly grim. By 8:00 a.m., General Monash swiftly ordered the 6th Australian Brigade, followed by the 7th and 14th, to cross the Somme's north bank, their mission to consolidate the recently captured ground. This crucial maneuver, however, demanded precious time and generated considerable confusion as vast numbers of troops converged on such a confined area. Monash's initial hope was for the 6th Australian Brigade to surge through the 5th, currently holding Mont Saint-Quentin, and exploit the open terrain beyond. Yet, by 11:30 a.m., the leading elements of the 6th Brigade received new orders to push southeast, securing the right flank, a position unbeknownst to Monash, already partially defended by the wary 18th Battalion. Concurrently, the Germans unleashed a ferocious artillery barrage upon the front line, held by the 20th and 17th Battalions, inflicting heavy casualties and crippling communications. Moments later, the 20th began receiving punishing fire from the hill and a brick wall of an enclosure to their right. It became terrifyingly clear the 17th had been forced to relinquish ground. The Germans, rallying rapidly behind their artillery storm, had, in minutes, enveloped the men of the 17th Battalion holding Mont Saint-Quentin. This counterattack, spearheaded by 3 full battalions of the 94th Infantry Regiment and 2 companies of the elite Prussian Guards, surged from the northeast, driving the Aussies from the summit, back through the village, to an old German position known as Elsa Trench. Simultaneously, more Prussian Guards struck the 20th Battalion's exposed left flank, a critical vulnerability as the 3rd Australian Division on their left had not yet advanced. The situation for the exhausted Australians was rapidly deteriorating into catastrophe. With the exception of scattered pockets of desperate resistance, virtually all hard-won gains achieved by the Australians on Mont Saint-Quentin's slopes had to be abandoned as they frantically dug in. Yet, by a near miracle, the 20th Battalion, now entrenched in Oda Trench, the 17th in Elsa, and the 19th in Agram Alley, managed to forge a tenuous, albeit incredibly thin, new defensive line. At this critical juncture, the reserves of the 18th Battalion surged forward, plugging gaping holes in a desperate, valiant stand to repel the enemy's onslaught. They succeeded. Halted by a relentless storm of Lewis gun and rifle fire, grenades and bayonets, the Aussies clung on, but only just. By the afternoon of August 31st, a fragile, temporary calm had descended upon this embattled sector. Lieutenant Percy Smay of the 24th Battalion, 6th Brigade, was one of 4 brothers who had heeded the call to arms. Leading his platoon forward to Goddle Trench, he vividly recounted the grim aftermath of the initial struggle. At first, all was silent. But when those who still lived saw that we were there, they began to moan piteously for help. Without hesitation, we set to work to do what we could for them. Kneeling down by the first living man, I saw that he was in a pretty bad state. Besides other wounds, his right arm was hanging to his shoulder by a small strip of skin and flesh. He begged me to cut the useless limb right off, and I tried to do it with a blunt jackknife, but could not manage it. Tending to the wounded through the long night was not Lieutenant Smay's sole preoccupation. He also had to prepare his men for a new offensive. Orders had arrived at 400 a.m. for a fresh assault to be launched at dawn, aiming to recapture the Mont and dislodge the Germans from their hilltop perch. Here's the fundamental blueprint for the renewed offensive. The 14th Australian Brigade, now also positioned on the Some's north bank, would drive southeast to capture Pa Run. Concurrently, the 15th Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Pompey Elliott, would attempt a crossing further downstream, aiming to assault the town from the south. This coordinated effort was designed to enable the 6th Australian Brigade to advance through the weary ranks of the 5th. The 24th Battalion would spearhead the left flank, moving towards Feuillaucourt, while the 23rd Battalion on the right would sweep south of the Mont. The 21st Battalion, advancing in between and behind, was tasked with seizing and consolidating the village itself. This entire operation was meticulously synchronized with an attack by the 3rd Australian Division on their left and the 3rd Corps further to their north. 0 hour for September 1st. Significantly, Wattle Day, in Australia, was set for 6:00 a.m., with the artillery barrage unleashing its fury at 5:30 a.m. What transpired? Let's meticulously review each sector's action. As a soft drizzle began to fall, the 24th Battalion pressed forward towards the Feuillaucourt Run Road, their ultimate objective the distant Tortel Trench. Among them was Percy Smay, who recalled an immediate issue. Some troops began inadvertently veering to the right. He and his platoon consequently found themselves crossing the road near the village's northern edge, where they were not only pinned down by fierce German defenses, but also dangerously close to their own artillery's falling shells. Recognizing his men were over-advanced, Smay skillfully withdrew them to the cemetery, then to a slightly more sheltered sunken lane. Yet casualties relentlessly mounted. At 1:30 p.m., after a renewed artillery bombardment, the 24th Battalion surged forward once more, capturing numerous prisoners north of the village en route to Plevener Trench. It was here that Smay encountered Lieutenant Edgar Towner, a machine gun officer whose actions would become legendary. Smay vividly recalled, the machine gun officer Mr. Towner put his company into the trench near us. Besides his own guns, he also mounted a number of German guns in order to make our line more secure against counterattack. Mr. Towner had been wounded in the head, but refused to go out of the line, saying there would be nobody to look after the guns if he went. He struck me as being extraordinarily cool and game. Nothing seemed to trouble him, and he worked tirelessly at getting his men and guns organized in the best possible positions, often incurring a lot of personal risk in doing so. His habitual calmness went a long way towards encouraging the men, refusing immediate medical evacuation despite a head wound. Towner continued to operate his gun as German pressure mounted, and the situation turned critical later that day. When the Australians were eventually forced to yield a short distance, one critical gun was left behind, its crew all casualties. Alone, Towner dashed across the perilous no-man's land and heroically recovered the weapon. Using this very gun, he continued to fiercely engage the enemy wherever they emerged, even silencing a German machine gun with his precise fire. After fighting relentlessly for over 30 hours, most of them wounded, his conspicuous bravery, unwavering initiative, and profound devotion to duty earned him the Victoria Cross. Meanwhile, the left flank of the 24th Battalion reached Feuillaucourt, discovering that the right flank of the 3rd Australian Division, whose 0 hour had been 30 minutes earlier, had already successfully crossed the Canal du Nord and entered the village by 700 a.m. While excellent progress was made east of the road towards Alaines, the left of the 24th was nevertheless stalled by resolute German resistance here. Rewinding to 6000 a.m., the 23rd Battalion, positioned far to the right of the 24th in Florina Trench, prepared to advance towards Mont Saint, Quentin's southwestern side. The moment they surged from their start line, they were met with a murderous hail of German machine gun fire from a barricade to their north. In such desperate moments, sheer audacity and individual initiative often proved salvific. Private Bob McTeer, a youthful runner, was dispatched to investigate and, without hesitation, took matters into his own hands. He fearlessly scaled the barrier protecting the machine gun, lobbed bombs into the position, and single-handedly captured the entire crew. McTeer then pressed on, capturing yet another machine gun, and was tragically killed while attempting to destroy a third. For this extraordinary act of valor, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Now free to advance, the 23rd Battalion moved past the exhausted remnants of the 5th Australian Brigade, who had endured a night holding Elsa Trench. They pushed through a shattered wall into an enclosure south of the village. However, intense fire from the sugar factory, positioned to the east, compelled them to fall back to Elsa Trench. The right flank companies of the 23rd also attacked, aiming for the old aerodrome south of the village, sustaining horrific losses before retreating to Goddell Trench. By early afternoon, the 23rd Battalion was reduced to a mere 120 men. They subsequently consolidated with 3 companies of the 21st Battalion, who had advanced in the center and were now intermingled in the same sector, with another devastating bombardment now pounding the village to disorient the defenders. This combined force launched its attack at 1:30 p.m. An official war photographer, present at this critical moment, captured a fascinating image of Captain Sullivan and men of the 21st, poised for their advance. Pivoting right, he seized another snapshot from within Elsa Trench, immortalizing the men as they charged towards a walled enclosure and surged into the village's western edge. Both battalions now fought a grueling ascent against stubbornly entrenched defenders. The 23rd Battalion eventually clawed its way to the crest, yet its right flank remained dangerously exposed, having lost all contact with adjacent units. At this critical juncture, a single company from the reserve 22nd Battalion surged forward, shoring up the vulnerable line on the right. With the village finally secured, the men of the 21st ultimately linked up with the 24th on their left, converging near the cemetery. But a little higher up the hill, surrounding a massive crater bristling with enemy machine guns, another astonishing act of individual heroism began to unfold. Sergeant Albert Lowerson of the 21st Battalion fearlessly led his men towards this perilous position, and his Victoria Cross citation encapsulates the sheer audacity. During the attack on Mont Saint, Quentin, north of Pa Run, when very strong opposition was met, and every foot of ground was stubbornly contested by the enemy, regardless of heavy enemy machine gun fire, Sergeant Lowerson moved about fearlessly directing his men, encouraging them to still greater effort, and finally led them on to the objective. On reaching the objective, he saw that the left attacking party was held up by an enemy strong post heavily manned with 12 machine guns. Under the heaviest sniping and machine gun fire, Sergeant Lowerson rallied 7 men as a storming party, directing them to attack the flanks of the post, rushed the strong point, and by effective bombing captured it together with 12 machine guns and 30 prisoners. The fall of the woodland at the Mont's summit and the crater, over which Lowerson and his men had so bravely stormed, utterly shattered the spine of German resistance in the sector. Any remaining defenders either fled in disarray or were ruthlessly flushed out by the relentless advance of the Aussie troops. Mont Saint, Quentin had fallen. As the smoke cleared and silence finally descended upon the village ruins, the utterly exhausted Aussies could at last pause to take stock of their monumental achievement and grim losses. In total, the assault had claimed some 3,000 diggers, killed or wounded, many of them hardened veterans who had faced the Western Front's brutal dawn. Their extraordinary bravery was recognized with a staggering 8 Victoria Crosses, bestowed upon men who had bled across these very fields in 1918, men fiercely proud to serve in the Australian Imperial Force. Today, the hallowed battlefield of Mont Saint-Quentin has partially faded into history. The expansion of nearby PA Run has subsumed much of the ground the Aussies once contested, and the trenches have long vanished. Yet the Mont itself proudly endures. A poignant memorial to the 2nd Australian Division stands nearby, gazing out over the very slopes they ascended to seize the village. A timeless tribute to all who fought and fell in a battle that General Rawlinson lauded as the finest single feat of arms of the war. Naturally, the fierce struggle for Mont Saint-Quentin did not conclude the First World War, but it dealt yet another devastating blow to the already beleaguered German forces. For days afterward, savage fighting persisted around PA Run, with relentless Allied assaults continuing as the enemy was forced to retreat toward the formidable Hindenburg Line. That ultimate defensive bastion was finally breached at the end of September, again with the pivotal assistance of Australian troops, who had already contributed immeasurably. Then, on November 11, 1918, the Great War on the Western Front finally ceased. It had been the most destructive four-year period in human history, engulfing over 40 countries across 4 continents and exacting a toll of millions of lives. Of the 340,000 Australians who volunteered for overseas service in the Great War, a staggering 213,000 became casualties, with 54,000 making the supreme sacrifice. Thousands more returned to Australia carrying unseen wounds, scars that, for many, would never truly heal. It is a sacrifice we must never ever forget. This concludes our series, tracing the extraordinary path of the Australian Imperial Force on the Western Front during the Great War. We trust this journey has been enlightening and a fitting tribute to the profound sacrifices made by those brave men.